So today we want to talk about the end of America, ? And what we might learn from the past that can help to inform the future. But what happens when the systems themselves are captured? Well, then you've got corporate lobbying, you've got dark money, you've got media capture, you've got tribal identity politics. And all of these things have turned self-interest into zero-sum warfare. So the system that is supposed to help us evolve has been captured. The good news is, for every meta crisis that we're facing right now, this is the good news, it can be fixed. That's the good news. All it takes is the perspective to be able to see it properly, the will to do it, and the capacity to harness development and enlightened self-interest. We can fix every problem in front of us. Welcome everybody to another episode of The Integral Edge. My name is Keith Martin Smith. I am the author most recently of When the Buddha Needs Therapy, and I work as an executive coach and as a book coach. And you can learn more about me at keithmartinsmith.com. So today we want to talk about the end of America, ? And what we might learn from the past that can help to inform the future. So that's what this talk is going to be about. And I thought that we would kind of start with a story. So if we go back some, 230 some years ago, we're in the late summer of 1787. And in Philadelphia, in Independence Hall, 55 delegates from all over the original 13 colonies have been meeting for a total of 116 days. And it's been a very intense 116 days. They've nailed the windows shut so that people couldn't eavesdrop. There's no press allowed. There were no notes allowed to be taken. There was no grandstanding. There were no speeches. There was no currying favor. It was extraordinary. It was 55 delegates that came together with the idea that they had to do something, or this new country that had just a few years before won freedom from the British was, in fact, going to fall into chaos and ruin and civil war. And there were a lot of pressures already. There were pressures between the southern states and the northern states, the bigger states and the smaller states. And all the former colonists had to rely on were these things called the Articles of Confederation, which were kind of flimsy and a bit of a Band-Aid. And there were all these problems that they didn't allow, like they didn't allow a federal government to raise taxes or to have an army, or to even pass laws that applied to all of the colonies. So you had 13 different sets of rules and regulations and tariffs and laws. And so it was really quite a bit of a mess. And so it's also important to note that it's easy to think now that a bunch of white dudes got together and they created the Constitution, big deal. But if we go back to 1787 and we actually look at what was going on then, Europe at the time was completely dominated by hereditary monarchies and aristocratic privilege. So Britain had a constitutional monarchy, but an incredibly powerful aristocracy that controlled everything. Class was everything. France had an absolute monarchy under Louis XVI, and Prussia, Austria, Spain, Russia, they all had hereditary monarchies. They also had aristocracies where birth, land ownership, and title meant everything and were far more important than any other determiners. Like things that we think are important today, like like gender, sex or race, they weren't really online back then. Latin America was under Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule. Asia and Africa were almost entirely ruled by either imperial dynasties, sultanates, or tribal kingdoms. So the U.S. was alone in what it was doing. I mean, there were no other countries that were doing this. It's important to consider that. So these 55 delegates spend 116 days in a brutally hot Philadelphia summer pounding out this thing called the U.S. Constitution, which some would argue is one of the greatest political documents ever created. And Benjamin Franklin, who was a diplomat, a patriot, a scientist, an inventor, a civic leader, a statesman, and just an all-around badass, he was sitting regal-like in a chair for much of the proceedings. He didn't contribute a ton. He was sort of observing, and someone asked him at the conclusion and the signing of the U.S. Constitution what he thought. And Franklin was sitting in a way so that he was facing the presiding officer's chair, of the whole delegation, in which George Washington had been sitting. And behind Washington, there was a carved image of a sun on the horizon. And so Franklin said this, quote, "I have often looked at that sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now, at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." End quote. So there were some interesting things that happened through this process. How did these guys create this document in 116 days? There were a lot of factors. One, they were in crisis. The U.S. was on the brink of collapse, so they had to work quickly. Two, they worked in secret. As I said, the windows were nailed shut. There was no press. There were no notes allowed to be taken. Letters, couldn't be written home that contained any information. It was completely secret. That meant that people could be really honest. They could be really candid. They could fight. They could be messy. They were also, truthfully, they were also white. They were also land owners, and they were almost all entirely deeply educated in Enlightenment principles, which we'll get to in a minute. This is going to be a really sort of foundational part of this whole talk. And they compromised. They had to compromise like crazy. So the U.S. Constitution, when it came out in 1787, was almost nothing but a patchwork of compromises. And just a few of them, you had the quote-unquote Great Compromise, which is big versus small states. So how do you deal if you have a big state and you have a small state, or you have a populous state and a non-populous state? How do you prevent the populous bigger states from getting everything they want? Or how do you balance the fact that maybe they should get a little more than the small states? And so the brilliant compromise was they came up with a Senate in which every state had 2 representatives, and a House of Representatives in which the population determined how many representatives you had. And then those 2 bodies, the legislature, had to work together to create laws. It's a pretty brilliant compromise. They had what's called the 3/5 compromise. And this sounds very ugly to our modern ears, right? This had to do with slavery. The northern states didn't have slavery. The southern states did. The southern states were very much willing and ready to pull out of the Union and form their own country. They were very, very much ready to do that. So to keep the Union intact, they came up with this compromise where slaves would be worth 3/5 of a person. When they did the census counting, which is how they determined how many people were going to be, how many representatives were going to be in the House. So it's ugly, right, especially to our modern eyes and ears, but it was a compromise. It was basically kicking the can down the road so that we didn't have to go to war with the South. We could put that off for another, 70, 80 years. The whole idea of the Electoral College, that was a compromise because some people wanted direct democracy And other people like Benjamin Franklin and others were very much leery of direct democracy. They were leery of having tyranny of the majority. And the Electoral College was designed to balance this, where in essence the electors could vote against the will of the people if the people were dumb enough to elect a tyrant, was sort of the idea. And then, of course, there was the whole balance of states' rights versus federal rights. And that's sort of epitomized by Hamilton and Franklin. Franklin despised the idea of a powerful federal government. He thought it would always lead to autocracy and tyranny. And Hamilton, on the other hand, was deeply distrustful of the common man. He has some quote, and this is from memory, but the quote was something like, "The people have been said to be the voice of God. This is not true. The people are turbulent and changing and seldom judge or determine right." Pretty arrogant, right? Very, very, very aristocratic of Alexander Hamilton there. So the whole point here, though, is that the delegates, they didn't try to get everything right. They got enough right to keep the Union intact and basically punted the big decisions down the road for another generation to deal with. So I'll say it again. 1787, there were no democracies anywhere in the world. No exceptions. And these men, and they were all men, they rebuilt the nation from scratch. They created one of the most powerful documents, political documents in human history, and they did it in 116 days. Okay. Benjamin Franklin's observation was, it's a rising sun, not a setting sun. So we're going to break down over the next 45, 50 minutes what's made the Constitution work from a developmental perspective, why it was able to create the kind of growth and stability that the United States saw by and large through much of its history, what's gone wrong, and what we might do about it. Okay, so in 2025, as we sit here, as many of you know, we're facing what's called the poly crisis or the meta crisis. And we have these huge existential crises, all completely created and sustained by humans, that could be species altering. We have artificial intelligence. We have late stage capitalism and the collapse of coherence. We live in a post-truth world. We have increasing wealth disparity between the extremely wealthy and the rest of us. We have all these environmental catastrophes that are happening. We have, extreme polarization that's happening not just in the US, but all across Europe and Asia. They keep going. And many intellectuals and many educated folks are saying that we're spinning faster and faster, and we're spinning downward, not forward. So I would say that the vast majority of thinkers on these topics these days are pessimistic about our future. And maybe that's for good reason, and maybe it's not. I'm not sure the pessimism is fully warranted. We'll see. That's what we're going to get into today. So for those of you that are not integralists, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the jargon that I'll be using. So there's basically four types that I'm going to talk about. There's red, amber, orange, and green. And these are just shorthands. Red, think anger. Amber, I don't know what think anger, amber. Orange and green, you can think like green liberal, the Green Party. But red, basically, this is the stage collectively where power and impulse rule. So it's driven by desire, by strength, by immediate needs. People at this stage tend to assert themselves boldly and see the world through the lens of dominance and personal gain. Here, you're capable of basic cause and effect thinking, strong emotional expression, and an emergent identity. But that identity is tied to ego and impulse. You can follow concrete rules, like don't steal cars. But that's tied to your ego and to your impulse. And the reason you follow the rules is because the only reason you follow the rules is because you don't want to get caught. So this is the stage that supports personal willpower, courage, and individual assertion, but it struggles with long-term planning, and it struggles with empathy beyond me and mine. Amber. There's a lot of amber in the United States, a lot of healthy amber. So remember, all of these red, amber, orange, green, they're not good or bad. They're just simply perspectives, ways of seeing the world. Amber, that's traditionalism, it's religion, it's the fundamentalist folks, it's the constitutionalists that believe the Constitution should be viewed and interpreted literally, which is ironic, which we'll get into. But amber is the stage of traditional order. People here value rules, roles, and belonging. They think in structured either or ways. So either or. So, you do this or you do that. There's no both and. There's not seeing that sophisticated complexity. And they see the world governed by a clear authority, whether it's God or the country or whatever. Their developmental capacity is they can hold a consistent worldview across time. So, their beliefs don't change, which isn't true for the red folks. They follow stable norms and roles, and they organize life through shared belief systems. So, we're both Mormons, or we're both Catholics, or we're both Baptists, or we're both originalists, or we're both aggressive egalitarians, or we're both whatever. Like, the idea is that we sort of hold these across time through shared belief systems. Their thinking is concrete, so they basically see externalities, and systematic, meaning they can understand rules and cause-effect relationships, but only within familiar or authoritative systems. So the rules only make sense. They don't think about the rules as being created by men. They think about the rules as being given, an absolute. Okay. Orange is the stage of rational achievement. So this is where people will begin to question authority, think for themselves, to seek success through evidence, strategy, and progress. The developmental capacity of orange is that they can think abstractly and hypothetically. They can compare multiple perspectives, and they can use logic to solve novel problems. So this includes systemic thinking and the ability to analyze, plan, and innovate beyond the amber conventional wisdom. And this orange-amber tension is what the Constitution is all about, and it's what we're going to get into, which is some of the things we're struggling with today. And we'll add in a minute, we'll add in a little bit about green here as well. Okay, so basically you can think of red as I do what I want because I can. Amber says follow the rules because they're right. And orange says let me test and decide what works best for me. So, taking a step back from 1787 and moving back now to 1776, 11 years before, just after the start of the Revolutionary War of the U.S. colonies with their colonial British overlords. And they write this thing called the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, many people would say, is a rationalist document, which it is not. It's partially rational. It's also partially amber. Let me just give a couple examples, and I just want to use this to demonstrate how the founders' own thinking evolves from the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution. The Constitution is an almost entirely orange document. The Declaration of Independence is a mix. So 2 examples of amber from the Declaration. One is statements like that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay, well, that asserts a universal moral law that's rooted in a mythic metaphysical source, God. So they're not appealing to rationality or natural rights. They're appealing to a big authority figure up in the sky. They also, in the Declaration of Independence, a hallmark of amber is us versus them thinking. So, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, we're justified, they're evil. That our tribe versus their tribe, we have the actual true book. We're the true believers, we're the chosen people. These are all indications of an amber mindset. And the us versus them framing in the Declaration of Independence, they really frame King George III, that make the colonists the righteous group and the British the oppressors, which is, said another way, it's classic amber ethnocentrism. My group's cause is divinely justified. Your group's cause is divinely bullshit. And so we're justified in going to war and killing you. Okay. But here's where it gets interesting. The Declaration of Independence is not just an amber document. There's a lot of orange in it as well. So remember that orange worldviews emphasize reason, individual rights, self-determination, meritocracy, and empirical verification outside of an external authority like God. So here are some examples of Enlightenment rationalism. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This really is like, it's a rationalistic, objective truth claim, and it's grounded not in tradition or divine command, but in reason. We, people in this room, hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, why? Because they're self-evident, that's why. Through the lens of reason, not through the lens of God. The whole premise of the Declaration of Independence is a justification through logical argument. They're saying there's a claim, there's a justification, there's evidence, and there's a conclusion. So it's a rational persuasion and systematic thinking that doesn't rely on we're the chosen people. The Declaration of Independence also focuses on individual rights and autonomy, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is classic orange, rights-bearing individuals pursuing their own flourishing. Right? You would never hear that in the British Empire or in the French monarchy or in the empires of the East. You would never hear someone say that all men have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because it wasn't true. You're there to serve the king. You're there to serve the aristocracy. That individual rights and individual autonomy, independent of the power sources that run the country, revolutionary. It's easy to mistake, to dismiss how revolutionary that thinking was. Okay, so said another way, all men are created equal. So this basically means that all men possess the same inherent moral and political status, regardless of their birth, their bloodline, or their social class. So what does this mean? Well, it assumes equal moral worth and equal relational agency, and it assumes a system where authority is derived from consent, not from tradition, not from God, and not from a bloodline. That phrase arises from Enlightenment rationalism, which reflects these things: universal human nature, independent of God, natural rights, not religions. Natural rights is a way of saying kind of like, it's natural that it rains, it's natural that we have these rights. That rational individuals deserve legal and political equality, regardless of birth, status, class, bloodline. And so what this is it's a move from divine right hierarchy into self-governed individualism. So said another way, it's a move from the group to the individual. So what's the stage that's set here is an elevator that is acknowledging amber norms and red realities and placing them in this brand new context of not just the philosophy of the Enlightenment, which had been around for a little while, but not a very long time, but into a political system that takes those principles of the Enlightenment and puts teeth in them, makes them actionable, makes them governable. Okay, so how? Now, the founders didn't know this. The founders were, obviously, they weren't developmentally aware, of course, but the phrases like all men are created equal, this is an example of a developmental attractor that future generations reinterpret and expand. It lays the groundwork for the next developmental stage, which is green or pluralism. And so, yes, the founders were only concerned about men. That's true. All men is what it says. But by their own logic and by the fact that they created this document that could evolve, it wasn't that long before it was all men regardless of race, all people, all men and women, and then all people regardless of their sexual orientation. The founders didn't prohibit those things. They didn't say it can only be only all men are created equal. They just said all men are created equal. And they left so many things open, both in the Declaration of Independence, but especially in the Constitution, by not defining them well, that it created this developmental attractor that allowed future generations that continue to evolve culturally and personally to continue to then evolve this living document of the U.S. Constitution. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go to the Constitution now and break that down. It's very interesting. This idea of enlightened self-interest. Enlightened self-interest. It is absolutely central to the U.S. Constitution, and it's where I'm going to put pretty much all of my attention for the next 10 or 15 minutes. So, enlightened self-interest. This was like one of the main principles that came out of the Enlightenment. And the founders were very well educated by those sorts of thinkers. So the idea with this was that the framers, they didn't just acknowledge that people operate out of self-interest, or said another way, that people tend to be selfish. They designed the entire system around channeling self-interest toward collective good. Again, this is revolutionary. They designed the entire system around channeling self-interest towards the collective good. Okay, so how did they do it? They made an assumption that humans are self-interested and that self-interest is not a problem. So, James Madison said, who was one of the main writers of the Constitution, he has this great quote, and it's, quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." End quote. So this isn't amber moralism that people should be good or that people were born sinful. It's orange pragmatism. People will act in their own self-interest. Okay, that's neither good nor bad. It's just pragmatic. And as we look at it, it's obvious. We and everyone else in many ways act in our own self-interest, much of the time. So what they realized was they had designed a system that helps to corral that self-interest towards a common good. Enlightened self-interest in action. But they didn't just stop with the idea the way the Enlightenment thinkers did. They actually institutionalized enlightened self-interest. So they created these three branches of government, right? They have the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative. And they gave them powers to pursue their own power and to pursue their own interest as a branch of government. And the idea was that they would limit the excesses of the other ones if you just allowed them, each branch, to be as self-interested as it wanted to be. So Congress would write the laws, the president would enforce them, and the judiciary would interpret them. And no branch could dominate another without being checked. Ambition was countered by ambition. Self-interest wasn't suppressed, it was strategically balanced. So they had this huge problem that I talked about. They had these problems of large states versus small states, and we talked about that. That was solved through coming up with the Senate versus the U.S. House of Representatives. Big states have lots and lots and lots of representatives in the U.S. House. Every state has 2 senators. And so rather than assuming consensus between the states, they assume conflict. But they turn that conflict into function by forcing cooperation and negotiation on a governance level as well, so that each group protects its own interest, but must do so through lawful means that also uphold the broader structure. So that's enlightened self-interest in system form. So, and then they thought this through, that in elections and representation, that self-interest was also in service of the whole here, because citizens vote not because they're angels, as James Madison said. Citizens vote because they want their voices heard. They want policies that benefit them. They want leaders who represent their values. In other words, they want me for me, mine, me and mine. And so the framers trusted that if people protected their own interest within a lawful, rational system, the collective outcome will be relatively fair and relatively stable. So if individuals are allowed to be individual and essentially act in their own self-interest, the system protects the whole and makes sure that the individual self-interest is balanced by a collective good. This is the heart of a liberal democracy. Freedom plus structure, laws, regulations, that creates a dynamic equilibrium. It creates an anti-fragility, as good old Taleb would say. Okay, so this is all to say that part of what the Constitution did was, again, assume people were self-interested. Sometimes selfish, sometimes not, but I care about my religion, my state, my crops, my town, my family, my views, my politics. They created systemic constraints and incentives that turn that self-interest into cooperation and balance. This helped create an amber loyalty to the Constitution itself. Very clever. It provided a rational, adaptable framework that was imperfectly extended over time. So the Constitution has grown quite a bit. It's built not on trust and virtue, but on trust in structure to turn self-interest into public good. So it seems pretty easy. They did it. It worked. What's the big deal, Keith? Okay. Well, let's take a look at the French Revolution. The French Revolution happened right around the same time. In France, when the French revolted, they didn't leave the amber structures in place of churches and different religions and social groups, civic groups of people with property and without property. The French destroyed the monarchy, destroyed the church, and completely violently overthrew the aristocracy. So they obliterated the amber foundations. This meant that red was completely unregulated, and it went completely bananas. Power grabs, guillotine justice, mob rule. And remember that in the red frame, I do what I want when I want, and I don't follow the rules. There was no stable orange frame like the U.S. Constitution. There were no institutional guardrails, and the French had no practice with a representational government the way that the U.S. colonists had. They went from an absolute monarchy where the king was completely in charge. Unlike the British, they didn't have a parliament at all. They just had the king who did whatever he wanted. And so when they tore that down, there was nothing there. There was no structure. There was no governance. There was no enforcement mechanisms, right? You tear down the monarchy and there's what's left? Nothing. So there was no sense of enlightened self-interest, and so the revolution just ate itself very quickly. It led to the reign of terror. It led to, mass murder, incredible instability, and eventually Robespierre and then Napoleon. So it led ultimately to dictatorship and essentially to quasi-monarchy once again. So the French, in essence, ended up where they began, which is with an absolute monarch ruling them. Okay. So how does this enlightened self-interest work? Let's just take sort of a quick overview here and just see how enlightened self-interest works with these red power selfish impulses, this amber fundamentalism, and sort of how it creates this developmental attractor, this developmental elevator. So from red, basically red is I want it, I take it. Impulsive, egoic, often aggressive, and transactional. So enlightened self-interest harnesses this by showing red that you get more of what you want by cooperating, building trust, and respecting the law. So the developmental move here is that red begins to internalize rules, consequences, and reciprocity, which is a move towards amber. So in other words, enlightened self-interest helps to amber amber up. The internal logic of someone red moving towards amber would be something like, I follow the rules not because I'm told to, but because it works better for me. And that's a movement. It's an evolution. Amber. So enlightened self-interest helps amber evolve from rigid obedience towards rational integrity. So traditional amber obeys the rules really out of fear or dogma. It enforces the hierarchy pretty absolutely, and it absolutely hates and suppresses dissent. Enlightened self-interest reframes this by saying that, look, the system isn't sacred, the government system, it's functional. And when you honor laws and values, you're also protecting yourself and your future, you're protecting your religion and your people, and you're protecting your right to choose your God and to worship him freely. So this turns their rigid duty into meaningful participation in the system. So they don't have to go off and form a cult. They can be part of the country. But the tradition becomes a chosen alignment with the effective order of an orange government. Because amber left to itself would become a theocracy or monarchy. That's what it does. Things are absolute. It's God-given. And because God gave it to us, F you if you're not one of us, you're one of them. And if you're one of them, you're bad and we should kill you. So the developmental move here is that amber begins to see beyond loyalty and moral absolutism and reaches towards the sort of early orange. And their internal logic is something like, what if the rules were created by people like me and they could be interpreted and improved upon? And we see this in the US all the time, right? We have traditionalists who use the system to try to rewrite it to reflect their values better, but they work within the system. They don't try to destroy the system. And this is why it's a developmental sleight of hand and why it works. Okay. A rough overview then is that in life, enlightened self-interest basically does this. It turns impulse into group regulation. It turns group regulation and obedience into self-reflection. It turns self-reflection into self-oriented principles. And that allows rules to become systems. And systems ultimately can be changed to serve the greater good, whereas rules are the rules. So that's the developmental move, okay? So let's see here. And again, we talked about this idea that, part of what the founders were doing and part of what the U.S. was involved with for the last couple hundred years was moving in some ways from a focus on the collective, the amber collective, my people, my God, the chosen ones, us versus them, to this idea of a sovereign individual. And the idea of a sovereign individual who exists, who determines for him or herself what is right or wrong, and who uses rationality and logic and reason to reflect on things like the rules and the laws are created by people and therefore they can be changed and they might actually be immoral, and we need to look to a deeper ethical and moral code to determine if I'm going to follow the rules or not. Or maybe if I don't want to follow the rules, then they need to be rewritten and reinterpreted and challenged and evolved to reflect a deeper care for a broader cross-section of people and things, like the environment and people of color and transgender people and nations all over the world, and the third world, countries trying to rise out of poverty, and universal health care, and blah, 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 right? So on we go. Okay. So this U.S. Constitution that created this government, orange rationalism, the U.S. at its best, from an orange perspective, it seeks win-win solutions and systemic stability. So it reframes self-interest not as like base greed, but as a principle that, when enlightened, creates prosperity for all. But it's the system that does this, not necessarily just the people, right? It's an enlightened in the sense of the Enlightenment, not like waking up, Zen style. But it's the system that's enlightened, and that's what allows this developmental elevator to work. So, okay, that brings us up to 2025. How's everybody doing out there? Feel free to send me a chat or a comment if you would like, if you have a question or a comment, as I refresh my throat here. All right, so here we are, 2025. Trump is back in power in the U.S., obviously. Shit's getting weird, as it does under him. People are freaking out, as they do. Is it going to work? Can the U.S. keep working? Okay, well, let's take a look. Let's take a step back. Here's where there are some problems, okay? The U.S. Constitution, which is, well, and let me start that over. The U.S. Constitution and liberal modernity, liberal in the sense of, not liberal politically, but liberal in the sense of liberal Enlightenment values. So the U.S. Constitution and liberal modernity, it was built 238 years ago. That's a long time, folks. It was built when problems were local, material, right, concrete, and linear. Self-interest could be made to align with the national good. Farming, trade, basic governance. But now what do we have? Well, now we have problems that are global. And, China doesn't do what we want them to do. We can't bring China into our enlightened self-interest. We have ecological problems which impact health and longevity and hormones and intelligence. And they're complex. We have these complex adaptive systems. I've spoke about this with David Arell the last time, but these hyperobjects, these things that are so big that even the smartest among us can't see them in their totality. Economies. Like, what is an economy? What is consciousness? What is the biosphere in its full complexity? How does the reality of energy production affect the rising third world in relation to countries like U.S. dominance and the power games that are going on in Russia and Ukraine, and some of the systemic things happening in Israel and Palestine, and what happens if you begin to move some of these pieces around on the board? It's very complex because it's global, it's ecological, and it's these hyperobjects that we can't fully see. The 2025 world is multi-systemic, it's interconnected, and it's fragile in ways that orange logic and orange self-interest alone can no longer hold. That's the bummer. The systems, the executive branch and the legislative branch, that once channeled enlightened self-interest, at least in the United States, they're captured now by unenlightened, different systems. So the Constitution assumed a balance of powers and a shared commitment to truth, reason, and civility. Well, we live in a post-truth world now. Reason has been in some ways dismantled by the next developmental wave, which is pluralism or postmodernism or green. And civility, well, the trouble with civility is based upon people evolving out of this amber idea, or for their amber including an us versus them, a healthy amber would be, well, all Americans, versus those dirty Europeans. But at least it helps for national cohesion. Orange is a little different because there you're not tied to having this idea of, you're not as tied to an us versus them in such a rigid way. The us versus them, the them gets smaller and smaller as we progress developmentally until eventually there is no other them. It's just all us, right? We're all in this together, folks. It's all one planet. Doesn't really matter if you live in Canada or the US or Africa. What we do to the global environment affects all of us. We're all full of plastic, right? The rich are full of plastic, the poor are full of plastic, right? It's microplastics. It's affecting all of us incredibly equally, right? It doesn't give a shit what your wealth is. Elon Musk has as much plastic in his brain as I do, I'm sure. So, it's a bit of a tangent. Let me get back on track here. Okay, so what I said was that these systems, these enlightened systems that channel self-interest into the developmental elevator, which helps red move to amber, amber get healthier and move to orange. That's all great, but what happens when the systems themselves are captured? Well, then you've got corporate lobbying, you've got dark money, you've got media capture, you've got tribal identity politics, and all of these things have turned self-interest into zero-sum warfare. The developmental elevator won't work without an uncorrupted system. So we are in trouble because the system is corrupted. So red and amber are no longer being channeled upward towards more care, compassion, differentiation, and perspective. They're being weaponized sideways. Win at all costs replaces compromise for the greatest good. So self-interest still reigns, right? The founders' self-interest still reigns, same as it did in 1787. But the system no longer rewards compromise or integration. It rewards virality, dominance, and loyalty to whoever is in power. Look at social media, folks, right? What a fucking shit show. Why? Because it's no longer about the greater good. Okay, and that's been, we have algorithms and whole systems of dopamine manipulation that are designed to deepen that. Even if we wanted to go against it, the whole capitalistic system as it's set up right now is working against that. Their self-interest is to maximize profit. And without an enlightened system to control their self-interest, well, we see the effects that are rampant everywhere right now. So, orange is great, right? Orange has all these great capacities. Let me just rattle them off again here. One second. Okay, so orange, right? Orange has the capacity to think abstractly and hypothetically, to compare multiple perspectives, to use logic to solve novel problems. It includes systemic thinking and the ability to analyze, plan, and innovate beyond conventional wisdom. Okay, so orange is great. It's where science comes from, logic, philosophy, like all these wonders of the modern world are rooted in this way of thinking. And a lot of the businesses that are running today come from this orange mindset, but it's been captured by short-sighted capitalists, right? So in its healthy form, orange is rational, ethical, and a meritocracy. But in its unhealthy form, it can become extractive, disembodied, and detached from relational or ecological consequence. Today's self-interest is financialized. So Wall Street logic shapes education, health, and even identity. It's automated so that AI and algorithms optimize for profit, not for wisdom, certainly, and definitely not for anything around the working towards a developmentally more sophisticated shared reality and a greater good. And then we have the power problem, people, right? Lobbyists ensure that the developmental elevator can't serve the greater good because it has to serve the short-term interests of the wealthy and of the companies that hire the lobbyists. So the system that is supposed to help us evolve has been captured. And the legislature and the executive, less the judiciary, but certainly those two, have been co-opted, captured by money. So in the 20th century, but really the 21st century, lobbying became institutionalized bribery. I would encourage everyone to go back and look at the history. You could look at Wikipedia, you could probably ask an AI engine, but like, what was it like when Lyndon Johnson created the Great Society in the 1960s? When he created Social Security, created Medicaid and Medicare, I think were both created with him. But he created these huge systems, right? Those bills were dozens of pages long. I think the entire Social Security Act was 29 pages long. 29 pages long. Do you know why? Because there weren't any fucking lobbyists back then. It hadn't occurred to companies yet to buy their representatives. And so for something like The Great Society by LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the politicians still worked for their constituents, and their constituents wanted better lives. They wanted their own self-interest, and they voted people in or out based on whether those politicians delivered. And then those politicians went to Washington and they helped create laws that would make their constituents happy. And then they got reelected. And then this system of this self-interest fueled societal evolution and growth. We ended up with this social safety net, which was revolutionary at the time. Okay, it would never happen today, people. The bill wouldn't be 29 pages long. Most bills, like Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, I think it was 1,600 pages. And every fucking company, insurance, pharmaceuticals, hospital groups, they all were in there. They all got their piece. They don't give a shit about the greater good. And they're not supposed to give a shit about the greater good. They're not wrong or evil for not giving a shit about the greater good. The system is supposed to protect us from their self-interest when the system itself is enlightened. So we have a problem. Our current system, it allows narrow interests to override the public will, even when everybody's in agreement. It rewards partisan loyalty over statesmanship, and it reduces democracy to a game of marketing and manipulation. In developmental terms, we could say that red power and orange cleverness and greed hijack the Constitution's orange institutional morality. So that's where we are. Okay, so what do we do here? So there's a couple things that I see. So at this point, you could easily sort of throw up your hands and walk away because it seems like it's a real problem. But here's where we're going to go to hope, okay? Because I have a few examples here. So I talked a little bit about green. Let me just repeat here what green is. So roughly speaking, evolution moves from red, power, amber, tradition and loyalty, to orange, reason and logic, and then to green. Green is the stage of pluralism and inclusion. Okay, the people at this stage, they value empathy, equality, honoring diverse perspectives. They shift from an individual to a collective, individual success and well-being to collective success and well-being. They're all about authenticity and emotional sensitivity. So green minds, unlike orange minds, they can hold multiple conflicting viewpoints without needing to resolve them. It's very important. They tend to prioritize shared meaning, cultural context, and relational depth. Most importantly, this stage introduces perspectival thinking, which is the capacity to reflect on our perspectives and how they're shaped by social and cultural lenses, which orange really can't do. Rationalists don't really reflect on the fact that they're looking through a rational lens. You could kind of say they are their rational lens. Whereas green can see that like, oh, that's just a perspective that's shaped by social and cultural issues and by your education. Okay. So the trouble with green, however, and I've given a number of talks on this, is that green can kind of go off the rails and attack and hate amber and attack and hate orange. So it can be very divisive. And if it's not plugged into this idea of enlightened self-interest, green can be very self-righteous, right? I mean, it's certainly happening right now. And rather than saying that people will always act in their self-interest and that's neither good nor bad, that's simply something that we need to acknowledge and harness, they tend to say, well, the self-interest of amber is childish and the self-interest of orange is greedy, and what we all need is to be like us. That doesn't work either. So here's what we need. We need to grow green up. That's part of it. So it needs to see that there's value in traditional views, that loyalty, obedience, strength, discipline, sacrifice, faith, these things have value. They may not have value for you, but they have value for other people, and that helps create stability. We definitely, as we've come into the 21st century, there's been a movement in schooling and education away from teaching the power of orange rationality, systemic thinking, meritocracy, individual rights, innovation, the rule of law, evidence-based governance, the limited reach of the powerful through laws. So we need to reinforce these things. We need to teach kids how to think, create universities that reward full orange rational thinking and presentation, and they don't coddle kids and make safety and belonging, which are green values, the most important ones, because then you don't create a developmental elevator and you send a whole generation out into the world that doesn't understand anything that I'm saying in this talk. We need to remove impediments to the system. This is the single most important thing. We have to get money out of politics. We have to get money out of politics. It's not going to be easy. It's probably going to take a grassroots movement and a constitutional amendment, and it will be fought by every company and every powerful individual. But listen, people, and they would argue that, look, regulation destroys innovation. Regulation is the bane of companies, et cetera. But all you have to do is look at the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, here in the United States. I don't hear a lot of conservatives saying, like, we need to tear down the FAA. I don't think Donald Trump tore down the FAA when he went through the Doge thing. Why? Because people want to fly in fucking safe airplanes. That's why. They don't want to fall out of the sky because you let the industry regulate itself. So senators, congressmen, presidents, everybody, including the people that fly on private jets, they want a strong Federal Aviation Administration because they don't want to fall out of the sky. And what that means is that the FAA put up guardrails. And they say, if you want to make money in this industry and you want to work in this industry and you want to open a company, if you want to be a JetBlue or you want to be a Southwest or you want to be, whatever, these are all the rules you have to follow. These are all the costs that you're going to have to incur. And it's up to you whether or not you want to join it or not. And those regulations work, and they work really well. Planes almost never crash. There aren't so many regulations that there are no companies that are willing to go into aviation. There's lots of companies, and they make lots of money. It proves that regulation can be intelligent, nuanced, serve the greater good, and allow companies to operate in their naked self-interest without fucking everybody over in the process. It's possible. There's one example. I've got another one too. So, all right. What about the stock market? What about money, right? I say, hey people, I think we need some more regulations on that. And what do you say? You go, good luck, Keith. It's impossible. How are you going to control the banks? How are you going to control Wall Street, the hedge funds? Well, time for another story. So in 1929, there was a stock market. And it was completely unregulated. And it crashed. It crashed spectacularly. It crashed so much that it destroyed the United States economy pretty quickly. And 5 years later, it was such a mess that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he created a regulatory body like the FAA called the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, in 1934. What was it designed to do? To put guardrails up so that people could operate on their own self-interest and not destroy the common good in the process. And what did they do? What did he do? Because FDR was a very smart guy. Well, he put basically a crook in charge of the SEC. He put Joseph Kennedy. Kennedy had made a fortune through manipulation and shady tactics that led to the 1929 crash. Said another way, he knew how corrupt and fucked up the system was, and he knew it better than most people. And so he built the regulations as an insider that were so strong, they worked so well, that we didn't have another stock market crash until those regulations were dismantled 70 or 80 years later. So just take a moment to think about that. Stock market ran great with Joe Kennedy's changes, which included things like he banned insider trading, which hadn't been illegal. He banned bump and dump schemes. He banned stock pools and market manipulation. He banned the heavy use of leveraging and speculative plays. And he banned questionable dealings in the liquor and film industries. And Roosevelt actually said, quote, set a thief to catch a thief, end quote. So Kennedy understood the system from the inside out, which made him uniquely qualified to build the guardrails that would actually work. So, Kennedy mandated financial disclosures. He created fair dealing requirements. He pushed back on rampant speculation. He helped build investor confidence in the crashed markets. He restored credibility in Wall Street after ripping it off for years. And they worked. The reforms worked. So here's the bad news. Well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is for every meta crisis that we're facing right now, this is the good news. It can be fixed. That's the good news. All it takes is the perspective to be able to see it properly, the will to do it, and the capacity to harness development and enlightened self-interest. We can fix every problem in front of us. The bad news is that we can't fix the polycrisis or the meta crisis from just an orange perspective because it can't see the full problem. It can't see complex adaptive systems in the way that green and further developmental views can see. So that's the bad news. The other bad news is that we as humans, we tend to not put guardrails up until there's a catastrophe. So the FAA was formed. Well, take a guess why the FAA was formed. because planes were falling out of the sky and people were dying. And so they created the FAA to put guardrails up. Why was the SEC created? Well, because the stock market imploded and caused not just massive hardship, but actual starvation in the United States. Cataclysmic economic meltdown. Nuclear weapons. After 2 civilian cities were vaporized, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in the Second World War, atomic nuclear energy was put into a lockbox, and there are only, a handful of countries that have nuclear weapons. What is it? US, Britain, France, Russia, Pakistan, India, Israel, North Korea, something like that. Not very many. The consequences of using those weapons is so cataclysmically terrible that the guardrails are up. It is very hard to get any information on how to build a nuclear bomb. Those secrets are locked away deeply inside of institutions across the countries that have them. So the bad news, folks, is that you want to control AI? We will control AI. If it doesn't destroy us, guardrails will go up. Right now, do you know how many regulations there are for artificial intelligence development? Yeah, that's right. None. There are no regulations. You can do whatever the fuck you want. So my prediction, and I hope I'm wrong, but I would take a healthy bet on this. My prediction is that in the next 5 years, AI is going to get to a point where it will cause some sort of catastrophic world-altering event, whether it destroys all of digital currency. I don't know what happens, but it'll be something that'll be so cataclysmically terrible that then guardrails will put up. Deep AI might go the way nuclear power is. It might be developed in secret, and only the most sort of locked down institutions in the deepest parts of the most advanced governments of the world. Oh, China. China's another nuclear power. I left that out. But we might realize that, like with nuclear power, AI is so dangerous and the potential for misusing it is so catastrophic that it needs to be put into a lockbox. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have to go through the catastrophe to get there. So, in summation, we can get enlightened self-interest back online in the United States, and we can let companies like Meta and whatever other incredibly self-interested companies, we can let them follow their own self-interest. That's the whole beauty and point of capitalism, is you get to go out there and try to make money. And it's up to us, the citizens, to force the legislatures and the executive to have the guardrails up so that as they pursue their self-interest, it is ultimately in support of the greater good. And the only way to do that is to get money back out of the system, which will probably take a constitutional amendment. It's a tall order, but it's not impossible. And as for the other issues like AI and some of the other meta crises, well, we'll probably have to face catastrophe. And when we face catastrophe, we will create the solutions that will address the problem. But I doubt, based on history, that we'll do it beforehand. It seems unlikely. Another depressing example would be the use of chemical weapons in the First World War, right? We developed these weapons, peacetime, mustard gas and sarin and all these other horrible, nasty nerve agents. And in this First World War, because they were new, everybody used them. And the effects were so unimaginably horrible that everyone decided to never use them again. I mean, which is kind of amazing. Even in the depths of World War II is the Nazi war machine, which was hardly an ethical enterprise. But even as they were losing the war, they never resorted to using chemical weapons. Think about that, right? It's kind of amazing. because everyone knew that once you open the lid on that monster, it hurts everybody. It's going to hurt your side as much as it is the other side. And AI might be the same way. I don't know. There's certainly a lot of good from it, but boy, is it going to create some pain and some disruption. Okay, I think that's enough. If you would like to comment or call in, you can call in through the screen there at the bottom. There's some option to call in. It doesn't tend to work very well if you're not on Chrome. I don't think this program, which is called Riverside, works all that well. And if you're getting weird messages on the call-in, then feel free to leave me a chat, and I'll read your chat and answer it as best I can. And for me personally, I remain hopeful. I always have, because, you just hope that you and the people you love don't have to go through the horrors of what might have to happen in order for us to wake up and put these guardrails and regulations back online, and to create an intelligent system which already exists, to re-empower this intelligent system which already exists. But we have a history of righting ourselves, and in so many areas. I like to tell the story just as far as like sort of racial equality and justice goes. My dad was born in 1936 during the Depression, and he graduated college, I think, in '59, and no blacks were allowed at that time in the University of Mississippi. And he lived to see a black man becoming president of the United States. That's incredible, right? One lifetime to see that. Okay, so Alex asked me, does resolving these political polarities involve taking money out of politics? Yeah, I think it does. I think it, again, if we go back and I would encourage everyone to look at how politics was done from the 1970s backwards. Before there was money in politics, before the Dobbs decision, before the Supreme Court in 2010 decided that corporations are people and they have the rights of people, they have freedom of speech and all these other ridiculous things, but they don't have any of our responsibilities, right? It's like a company can pollute my backyard and I can try to sue them, but no one's going to go to jail, and I will probably lose against their team of lawyers. Whereas if my neighbor, Bob, if he's taking the oil out of his car every third Wednesday and dumping it into his yard, and that kills all my plants and blah, 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 I can sue him. I'll probably almost certainly win, and he might go to jail. So, the trouble with money in politics is that you make corporations people and you give them those protections in the 2010 Dobbs decision, but you don't force them to have the responsibilities. And so this idea of this enlightened self-interest, that the system, you make it much harder for the system of this developmental elevator to actually work, because the enlightened self-interest system is broken once you allow money to influence politicians, because now their self-interest is about getting reelected, and that has to do with paying creed to the hand that feeds them and pays for them and pays for their campaigns. And those campaigns can be dirty and dishonest, and they can manipulate people into not understanding what's really going on. So getting money out of politics would, in some ways, might force us back to a time when politicians were elected based on what they did, for good or bad, in the eyes of their constituents, rather than the eyes of their corporate benefactors. All right, everybody. Well, I hope you found this interesting and illuminating. It was fun to talk about. And if you think of any questions or comments afterwards, feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me through my website, keithmartinsmith.com. And as always, thanks for being a part of the community. Thanks for listening. I will not be here in 2 weeks. I will be on holiday, so I'll see you all in July.